The static on the camcorder screen resolved, not into the familiar wood-paneled walls of my apartment, but into a swirling, impossible grey that seemed to hum with a low, guttural frequency. This was my first mistake, I know, recording the descent. Gabriel Thorne. That's me, and I was supposed to be documenting the peculiar chill that had settled over the old Baker Street district, a chill that had nothing to do with the late October air. My cat, Bartholomew, a creature of obsidian fur and emerald eyes that usually tracked dust motes with unnerving precision, had been the first to truly notice it. He'd refused to step foot outside the apartment for 3 days, his usual confident swagger replaced by a low continuous hiss directed at the closed front door. Now the static itself seemed to writhe, coalescing into a vaguely human shape, a silhouette against the impossible grey. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen in the urban legends whispered about in hushed tones. This wasn't the slender man with his impossible limbs or the Jersey devil with its leathery wings. This was something wetter, a figure that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its edges blurred as if viewed through a thick, oil-slicked lens. I fumbled with the camera trying to steady my shaking hands, the cheap plastic digging into my palm. The hum intensified, a sound that vibrated not just in my ears, but deep within my bones, a resonant thrum that felt like the prelude to something truly ancient and awful. The silhouette began to move, not walking, but sort of unfolding. It was as if the very fabric of reality around it was rippling, allowing it to progress. A faint metallic tang, like old pennies left out in the rain, began to fill the air, even through the closed window of my recording space. Bartholomew, who had been huddled beneath the sofa, let out a choked yowl, a sound of pure terror that sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. I zoomed in, the image pixelating and distorting, but still I could make out details. It had arms, long and spindly, that seemed to end in something akin to dripping icicles, each one catching the faint, internal luminescence of the grey void. This encroaching dread was the second mistake. I should have turned the camera off, should have fled, should have ignored the morbid curiosity that had drawn me to this part of the city. But the urban legend, the one about the man who walked between the cracks of reality, the one that always mentioned a specific street corner near Baker, just past the old Frosty's ice cream parlor, had held a morbid fascination for me. It spoke of a place where the veil was thin, where echoes of things that should have stayed dead could bleed through. The figure was closer now, the grey backdrop healing away to reveal glimpses of what looked like slick, polished obsidian, impossibly smooth and reflecting nothing. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, and something else, something sickly sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit left to rot. Bartholomew was now a frantic blur of black fur, darting from corner to corner of the apartment, his claws scrabbling uselessly against the hardwood floor. I could feel it too, a pressure building behind my eyes, a dizzying sensation that made the room tilt and sway. The camera continued to record, a silent, unblinking witness to my unraveling reality. The figure was now directly outside my apartment door, its form solidifying slightly, revealing a face that was less a face and more a collection of wet, glistening orifices arranged in a mockery of human features. It reached out a hand, those icicle-like fingers extending, and touched the door. Not a knock, not a push, but a sort of torpid absorption. The wood seemed to soften, to ripple where its fingers made contact, as if it were made of wet clay. A low, wet sound, like 1,000 tiny mouths slurping simultaneously, emanated from it. Then the door began to buckle inward, not with the sound of splintering wood, but with a sickening, tearing noise, as if the very atoms of the door were being unstitched. Bartholomew let out a final, piercing shriek, and then there was only the sound of that wet, insidious tearing, and the persistent bone-deep hum of the impossible grey. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than any October wind, that this was no longer just an urban legend. The tearing sound ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence broken only by Bartholomew's ragged breathing, a desperate heaving sound from somewhere in the darkness. The camera, still somehow recording, captured only the faint, distorted outline of the doorknob, now twisted and warped as if melted by an unseen heat. The overwhelming smell of rotten damp earth intensified, clinging to the back of my throat. I could feel a primal urge to curl into a ball, to become as small and insignificant as possible, but the compulsion to document, to witness, held me frozen. The greyness outside the doorway was gone, replaced by an oppressive blackness that seemed to swallow the light from the camera's meager beam. Yet, within that blackness, there were movements. Not the fluid, unfolding motion of the figure from before, but a series of sharp, jerky twitches, like a puppet with its strings tangled. Bartholomew let out a low growl, a sound that was more rumble than bark, and I realized he was crouched, his fur bristling, eyes wide and fixed on a point just beyond the camera's limited field of vision. I tried to pan the camera, but my hand was slick with sweat, the grip slipping. A single, impossibly long strand of something dark and glistening detached itself from the blackness and snaked across the floor, leaving a damp, oily trail. It moved with an unnerving autonomy, probing, testing. It brushed against Bartholomew's hindquarters, and he recoiled with a yelp, scrambling further into the shadows. The strand then retracted, disappearing back into the void, and for a moment there was nothing. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, threatening to snap. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear anything, any indication of what lurked just out of sight. Then a faint, rhythmic thump, thump began, emanating from the direction of the hallway. It was slow at first, deliberate, each beat echoing in the stillness. It sounded like something heavy and soft being repeatedly dropped, then picked up. The rhythm accelerated, growing more frantic, more desperate. Bartholomew began to whine, a high-pitched, mournful sound that spoke of a fear deeper than any I had ever heard from him. I managed to shift the camera, the lens catching a glimpse of the hallway floor. The oily trail left by the strand was spreading, a dark stain that seemed to be growing, seeping into the wood. The thump defente was almost deafening now, a frantic, irregular pounding that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force, pressing in on me, on Bartholomew, on the very air we breathed. I could feel a strange pressure building in my ears, a popping sensation, as if the atmospheric pressure was rapidly changing. The camera's battery indicator flickered, a stark reminder of how little time I had left. I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever was making that noise, whatever was leaving those trails, it was coming for us, and it was getting closer. The legend of Baker Street, the whispers of things that walked between, were no longer just stories. They were a hungry, tangible reality. The frantic thumping abruptly ceased, leaving behind a ringing silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. The oily, black trail on the hallway floor had spread, now reaching the warped threshold of my apartment, a viscous, glistening tide that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. Bartholomew, no longer whining, had gone utterly still, his body a rigid silhouette, against the faint light filtering from the camera's lens. His emerald eyes, usually so expressive, were wide, unblinking pools of pure, unadulterated terror. I felt a cold dread seep into my very marrow, a primal fear that whispered of ancient things best left undisturbed. A new sound began, a wet, scraping noise like 1,000 fingernails dragging across damp parchment, originating from within the blackness that had consumed the hallway. It was a sound that spoke of immense, unnatural effort, of something trying to force its way through a barrier far too thin to contain it. The oily trail on the floor began to recede, as if being drawn back by an unseen force, leaving behind a faint, iridescent sheen that shimmered with disturbing hues. I adjusted the camera, trying to focus on the point where the trail was vanishing, but the blackness remained stubbornly impenetrable. Then a single pale appendage, impossibly thin and segmented, emerged from the oppressive dark. It was not like the dripping icicles from before, nor the oily strand. This was bone white, slick with an unseen fluid, and it moved with a disturbing arachnid grace. It twitched and probed, sampling the air, the floor, the very silence itself. Bartholomew let out a barely audible whimper, pressing himself further into the shadows behind me. The appendage extended, reaching towards the warped doorway, and I could see that its tip tapered to a needle-sharp point. As it neared the doorway, the air grew colder, a biting, unnatural chill that seeped through my clothes and into my bones. The faint luminescence of the iridescent sheen on the floor intensified, casting strange, shifting shadows that danced with a life of their own. The appendage paused, quivering slightly, as if sensing my presence, my fear. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, it jabbed downwards, piercing the warped wood of the door. A low, guttural hiss, like steam escaping a ruptured pipe, escaped the blackness, followed by a sound that made my stomach clench to a wet, tearing noise as if something was being painfully dismembered. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was no longer just an urban legend. This was a violation. The piercing hiss subsided, replaced by a series of rapid, wet clicks, like the sound of 1,000 tiny, chitinous legs skittering across a smooth surface. The pale, segmented appendage retracted, leaving behind a small, perfectly circular puncture wound in the warped wood of my apartment door. The iridescent sheen on the floor, which had pulsed with an unsettling light, now faded, leaving only a damp, dark stain. Bartholomew, who had been a statue of terror, began to tremble violently, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I could feel my own heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. The camera's battery indicator flashed red, a desperate plea for power that I couldn't answer. Time was running out, and the unseen presence outside my door seemed to be playing a drawn-out, agonizing game. I risked a slight shift, trying to catch any movement in the hallway, but the blackness remained absolute, an impenetrable void. The air, however, was changing again. The cloying sweetness of rot was being replaced by a sharp metallic tang, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something else, something acrid and faintly chemical. It prickled at my nostrils, making my eyes water. A low, almost imperceptible vibration began to emanate from the floor, a subtle tremor that seemed to grow from the very foundations of the building. It wasn't the rhythmic thumping from before, but a continuous unsettling hum, like a massive, unseen engine struggling to turn over. Bartholomew let out another soft whimper, his gaze fixed on the puncture wound in the door. I followed his gaze, and in the dim light of the camera, I could see a faint phosphorescent glow emanating from within the tiny hole, a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the growing vibration. This was the insidious part of the urban legend, the part that spoke of the thinning, where the rules of our reality began to fray at the edges. It wasn't just about monsters appearing, it was about the world itself becoming unstable, pliable, susceptible to things that defied logic and physics. The vibration intensified, and the warped door began to creak and groan, not from being pushed, but from an internal pressure, as if the very material of the wood was being strained from within. I knew, with a chilling clarity, that the puncture wound was not just a hole, it was a conduit, a tiny breach through which something vast and terrible was beginning to seep. The creaking of the warped door intensified. Not with the splintering sound of stressed wood, but with a wet, tearing sigh, as if the door itself was weeping. The sickly green light emanating from the puncture wound pulsed brighter, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the room. Bartholomew, his body rigid with primal terror, began to emit a low, continuous growl, a sound of defiance against an enemy he clearly understood was beyond his ability to combat. The metallic tang in the air sharpened, now carrying an undertone of something burning, a faint but persistent scent of smoldering plastic. Then the puncture wound began to expand. Not a violent shattering, but a slow, deliberate widening, as if the edges of the wood were being twin-dissolved. The sickly green light spilled out, bathing the floor in an unholy glow. From within the expanding aperture, a series of bulbous, pulsating sacs began to emerge, glistening with an viscous amber fluid that dripped onto the warped threshold with a soft, wet plop. Each sac seemed to possess a rudimentary, eye-like structure, a dark, unblinking orb that swiveled independently, taking in the room with an unsettling predatory intelligence. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a physical reaction to the sheer wrongness of what I was witnessing. The camera's lens began to fog over, not from condensation, but from a fine, oily mist that seemed to emanate from the sacs. Bartholomew let out a strangled yowl and retreated further into the corner, his fur standing on end. The vibration from the floor intensified, no longer a subtle hum but a deep resonant thrum that shook the very foundations of the building, making the cheap plastic of the camera tremble in my hand. The urban legend spoke of the unraveling, where reality itself began to fray, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I was witnessing that unraveling firsthand. The world as I knew it was being systematically unmade, thread by whatever monstrosity lay beyond my door. The pulsating sacs, each with its malevolent, unblinking eye, continued their unnerving emergence from the dissolving doorway. The amber fluid they secreted dripped onto the floor with a disturbing viscosity, forming small iridescent puddles that seemed to absorb the already limited light. The metallic, ozone-like scent was now overpowering, laced with the acrid odor of burning plastic, as if the very air was being chemically altered. Bartholomew, pressed against the far wall, let out a series of sharp, distressed chirps, a sound I'd never heard from him before, a desperate plea that resonated with pure, unadulterated dread. The warped door no longer resembled wood. It seemed to be a permeable membrane, yielding to the inexorable pressure from beyond. From the widening aperture, a colossal obsidian-like limb began to unfurl. It wasn't an arm, not in any conventional sense. It was more like a living, polished root, impossibly smooth and jointed in ways that defied anatomical understanding. Its surface gleamed with an oily sheen, reflecting the sickly green light of the sacks in distorted, nightmarish patterns. As it extended into the room, it seemed to absorb sound. The ambient noises of the city outside Funde, a distant siren, the rumble of traffic fading into an oppressive silence. I could feel a pressure building in my eardrums, a disorienting sensation akin to extreme altitude changes. The camera's autofocus struggled, the image blurring and sharpening erratically as the limb moved, its slow, deliberate progress radiating an aura of immense, ancient power. The urban legend had mentioned the consumption, the way reality itself would be ingested, absorbed into whatever existed beyond the veil. I realized with a cold, stark clarity that this limb was not merely entering my apartment. It was actively consuming the space, erasing it from existence as it moved. The camera's battery indicator blinked weakly, a final desperate flicker before darkness. The obsidian limb, slick and impossibly smooth, continued its inexorable advance, its every movement accompanied by a faint sibilant whisper that seemed to coil around my very thoughts. The pulsating sacks, their unblinking eyes, swiveling with a disturbing autonomy, now formed a grotesque fringe around the expanding doorway, their amber secretions creating a shimmering, treacherous tide on the floor. The burning plastic odor was now thick, cloying, and I could feel a prickling sensation on my skin as if microscopic embers were settling upon me. Bartholomew, utterly paralyzed by fear, emitted a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from deep within his chest, a desperate, futile defiance. The limb reached the center of my living room, its polished surface reflecting the distorted shapes of my furniture, twisting them into alien geometries. It moved with a strange, fluid grace that belied its immense size, a silent, predatory unfolding. The camera, its battery finally giving out, went dark, plunging the immediate vicinity into the oppressive blackness that now filled the hallway. Yet even without sight, I could feel its presence, a palpable weight in the air, a suffocating pressure that made breathing a conscious, labored effort. The whispers intensified, weaving themselves into the fabric of my mind, not with words, but with impressions impressed in images of vast, starless voids of colossal, indifferent entities of a reality that was utterly alien and terrifyingly hungry. The urban legend spoke of the imprint, the way the very essence of the consuming entity would stain the fabric of existence, leaving behind echoes of its passage. I could feel that imprint now, a chilling resonance within the room, a subtle alteration of the air, of the silence, of my own perception. It was as if the space itself was being rewritten, the familiar contours of my apartment overwritten by something ancient and incomprehensible. The only sound was Bartholomew's ragged breathing, a desperate counterpoint to the oppressive silence, and the faint, sibilant whisper that was slowly, inexorably claiming my reality. The whispers solidified, coalescing not into words, but into a series of resonant frequencies that vibrated through my very bones, each pulse a shard of alien consciousness. The obsidian limb, now a dominant presence in the room, seemed to pulse with its own internal dark light, its polished surface rippling as if alive. The amber fluid from the sacks had spread further, forming a slick, shimmering carpet that distorted the familiar shapes of my furniture into grotesque caricatures. Bartholomew had ceased his growling, his body now a rigid statue of terror, his emerald eyes wide and reflecting an impossible, non-existent light. A new sensation began, a subtle tugging at the edges of my perception, as if the very memories and sensations that constituted my being were being gently, insistently pulled away. It wasn't painful, not yet, but profoundly disorienting, like watching your own reflection begin to fade. The urban legend had a section on the erasure, where the encroaching entity didn't just consume space, but the very concept of what had occupied it. I could feel this happening now, a slow, methodical unmaking of Gabriel Thorne. My own thoughts felt distant, like echoes from a dream I could no longer fully recall. The limb moved again, a slow, deliberate sweep across the room, and where it passed, the air seemed to shimmer and distort, as if reality itself was a fragile tapestry being unraveled. The scent of burning plastic and ozone intensified, now carrying a faint coppery undertone like old blood. Bartholomew let out a choked gasp, a single sharp sound that was immediately swallowed by the oppressive silence. I could feel my own consciousness thinning, becoming less defined, my sense of self dissolving like sugar in water. The whispers, now a constant thrumming in my skull, spoke of an infinite, indifferent expanse, a place where individuality was an anomaly, a fleeting imperfection to be smoothed away. The unmaking accelerated, a dizzying descent into a void where the concept of self was a forgotten, irrelevant notion. The obsidian limb continued its silent, inexorable sweep, and where it touched, the remnants of my apartment, the sofa, the bookshelf, the very air tree seemed to melt, to dissolve into the encroaching blackness. The coppery scent, once faint, now dominated, thick and metallic, like a mouthful of old pennies. Bartholomew was no longer a distinct shape. He was a smudge of shadow against the encroaching void, his terrified chirps reduced to mere vibrations in the oppressive silence. The whispers, no longer external, were now an intrinsic part of my fading consciousness, a resonant hum that echoed the vast, indifferent expanse the legend had hinted at. They spoke of endlessness, of a singular, all-consuming awareness that transcended form and memory. My own name, Gabriel Thorne, felt alien, a label attached to a rapidly dissolving entity. The urban legend's final chapter, the one I had dismissed as hyperbole, spoke of the assimilation, where the encroaching horror didn't just destroy but absorbed, its essence becoming the new reality. I could feel it now, this assimilation, a terrifying merging where my fading consciousness was being drawn into the vast cold immensity. The obsidian limb was no longer just an external threat. It was a part of me, its polished surface reflecting the dissolving remnants of my own being. The sickly green light from the sacks, once a beacon of horror, was now a dull, internal glow, the last vestiges of a reality I could no longer grasp. The camera, a silent witness to my unmaking, was a forgotten artifact, its purpose rendered meaningless. There was only the hum, the metallic tang, and the slow, inexorable dissolution into something vast, ancient, and utterly beyond comprehension. The hum deepened, no longer a vibration but a fundamental frequency of existence. The metallic tang had faded, replaced by an indescribable scent, a sterile absence that was more unsettling than any odor. The obsidian limb, no longer a distinct appendage, had integrated, its smooth, dark surface now a part of the pervasive, all-encompassing blackness that defined this new, unformed reality. The pulsating sacks, their eyes now dim embers, had dissolved, their amber secretions absorbed into the infinite. Bartholomew, or what had been Bartholomew, was a faint echo, a memory of warmth and sound now utterly subsumed. There was no longer a me, no Gabriel Thorne, no observer. There was only the hum, the vast, indifferent expanse, and the slow, deliberate process of assimilation continuing. The concept of an urban legend felt like a quaint, almost laughable notion from a forgotten dream. There was no story, no narrative. Only the quiet, eternal expansion of a consciousness that had no beginning and would have no end. The space where my apartment had been, where Baker Street had stood, was now merely a ripple in this boundless void, a fleeting anomaly that had been smoothed away, its existence erased with a quiet finality. The camera, its purpose served in documenting the initial breach, was now a silent artifact of a reality that no longer existed, its final moments of recording a faint, lost signal in the infinite. The whispers were gone, replaced by the silent, all-consuming truth of the void, a truth that was absolute, eternal, and utterly devoid of anything resembling life or consciousness as it had once been known.